The topic I'd like to talk about a bit today is the topic of chronic pain, and that could include mental or emotional pain. Pain that sticks around and doesn't show any sign of going away quickly is really the ultimate test. It's a test for me if I've got chronic pain, obviously enough, but it's also a test for any healthcare professionals that are purporting to help me. It's a test because if I am the person suffering from chronic pain, I really am hypersensitive to any bullshit, to any nonsense that people might come out, well-meaning or otherwise. So anything that is said to me that is superficial and that isn't really going to help, it really does stand out as being useless in a situation like this. And it's very hard to say something to someone with chronic pain or who is in a lot of mental pain that is genuinely going to be, I won't say helpful because that implies there's some kind of way to magically make the pain go away, and there isn't. That isn't false in some way, or pretentious, or deceptive. It's kind of like we have to really look into ourselves to come out with something that's authentic, rather than just coming out with whatever we might have learned or whatever we might have been told in the past. Second-hand knowledge isn't a good thing in this situation. The relationship of our culture with pain is particularly suspect. In our particular culture, which is to say what Schumacher calls the global megaculture, which has been proliferating and taking over the whole planet for the last 100 years or so, is a culture that is based on manipulation and technology and methods and strategies. And this doesn't work with pain, with chronic pain. It works in a superficial way to the extent that for a short space of time we might be able to do something about it, but then there's a backlash which means that we would have been better off not doing anything in the first place rather than going down that road. And the other possibility is that we use heavy medication, so that can take the edge off pain or blur it quite a lot, but at the expense of blurring our consciousness and almost extinguishing our consciousness. So then we're in a kind of a dissociated daze. As Ivan Illich says, we reduce to being the impotent spectator of our own decay, so to speak. Not a particularly nice position to be in. We're certainly not engaged in it. And if we're not engaged with our pain, or if we're not engaged with whatever's going on with us in life, then that's not healthy. That generates a whole new level of pain, which is the pain of dissociation, or the pain of alienation, where we become this onlooker. We've been cut off from our own lives. It's all going on, but there's a barrier now between me and what's happening in my life. And that's the worst type of pain in the long run. In the short term, it might seem like a relief, but over time, it shows itself to be a more horrific form of pain. It's the pain of being stuck in the denial of pain. And is always, as is always the way, the avoidance of pain seems like a great thing, and we're very incentivized to do whatever we can do, and we ignore the fact that the ignoring of pain brings about worse pain. So that's the human predicament in a nutshell, really. Our relationship with pain is such that we don't really understand this point. We think that it is something that can be manipulated away, it is something that can be controlled or managed. If we had enough imagination or insight, we'd see that the idea of managing our pain is a particularly gruesome one. Not only do I have the pain, I have the responsibility of managing it, whatever in God's name that's supposed to mean. Because there is no managing pain, we can just play games with it. We can temporarily distract ourselves from it at the expense of having all of that pain come back with extra interest added on later on. But there is a way to work with pain. It just happens to be outside of the remit of our rational, controlling culture. It's not something we'd ever think of. It's not something that even if someone did mention it to us, we wouldn't take it seriously. And what it all comes down to is our understanding of who we are, or our understanding of what the self is, and what our relationship with the self is. This is an awkward kind of a subject, and it sounds strange to be talking about the self as if it is some kind of arbitrary structure, which it is. We're used to seeing it as the bedrock of our personal reality. Everything has to be done for the self, because beyond the self there is nothing. The self is the ultimate statement of who we are. Only it isn't. Who we are is nothing so crude as the self, which is kind of like a concrete block, as we could discover if we were interested enough to put effort into that. We could discover that there is a subtler way to be in this world than the self-like way. So even though talking about the self in inverted commas in this way tends to put people off, and it doesn't tend to make sense, unless it does make sense, in which case it's fine, but for most people it doesn't make sense. But it can nevertheless be quite easily explained. And we can explain it by saying that we have these two modes of being in the world. And we know them on some sort of a level, even if we don't know that we know them. And one way is when we're relaxed and chilled out and genuinely at ease, in which case our boundaries get pretty much erased and our sense of ourselves becomes more expansive. So there's no sharp cut-off point between self and other, or me and you, or me and the world. So we could call that, people have spoken of that as a kind of environmental awareness. An environmental awareness is an awareness that allows us to see the interconnectedness of all things, and we stop asserting that this little bit is me and I don't care what happens outside of it, because this is me and I don't care about that. That's non-ecological awareness. And non-ecological awareness, which is a mode we've all been in, creates huge problems, because it's a form of denial, of course. We can't do that. We can't say, I just care about my patch, which is me. I don't care about anything else. Because eventually it'll come on top for us. And the whole damn thing will go pear-shaped. So the environmental mode of awareness comes naturally to us when we're in touch with our own well-being. It's as if our sense of being in the world includes everything else and doesn't see everything else as an enemy or competition. A very natural way to be in the world. And it's the only decent way to be in the world. It's the only way that actually feels good. The other way of being in the world is what we could call isolationist, where the boundaries that show where I end and you begin, or where what is me and what is not me, what is self and what is other, are very, very sharply drawn. And so then I have an isolated existence, and my awareness is not at all environmental. What's around me is by definition not important, because I've made only me important. So this mode of being in the world is also very familiar to us. It's our normal way of being in the world. Sometimes it gets extra tight, extra painful, if I'm very angry or jealous, or I'm in a sulk. I'm very aware of myself as being a painful knot of tension, and that this painful knot of tension, by being so tense, I'm aware that this separates me from life, and that this is a very, very painful place to be. And that is the situation of the concrete self anyway, but we don't see it, we don't experience that suffering unless we really go into some kind of negative emotional state. And even then, we almost always blame someone else or something else for it. We don't actually see the root cause of our suffering, which is the fact that we have become isolated or alienated from everything else. And it's definitely the case that our particular culture operates by encouraging everyone to be isolationist in this way, and to perceive themselves as being this totally separate self. It's kind of the same as saying that our society encourages us to become more and more narcissistic. It's got to be true that if we weren't narcissistic, capitalism as we know it could not exist, competing with each other, exploiting other people who we're capable of exploiting wouldn't exist. All of that carry on can only exist when we're in the isolationist mode, when we've got this idea of ourselves as being separate from everything else, and of having to fight against everything else or compete with everything else. So we're setting ourselves up against the world. It doesn't mean that we don't form groups or band together, because in that case it's us against the world. It's the same thing on a tribal scale. And this is the age-old curse of humanity, and it is pretty much as evident now as it ever was. It's the curse of humanity because it causes us so much pain and unnecessary pain, and it causes so much conflict. And it's all based on a stupid illusion that doesn't benefit us anyway. And yet we insist on doing it to ourselves wherever we go. Wherever nationalism keeps raising its head, or whatever other form of groupism, this is because the self is asserting itself. And even though the environmental mode of being in the world feels so much better and there's nothing to fight against, even though we still have difficulties that we need to cope with, it's not a them and us situation. And we have far more resources available to us when we're in the environmental mode, because we're not separating ourselves from the deeper root of things. We can think about these two ways of being in the world in a kind of topological sense by imagining a flat surface. So if we've got a flat surface of some kind of malleable materials, maybe a soft metal, what we can do is we can put a big dent in it so that one thing sticks out. So then we've got this basic figure ground situation where the figure gets all the glory and we forget the ground, even though without the ground there would be no figure. And this is the isolation mode, the non-environmental mode of experiencing ourselves or experiencing the world. We think we're that. We think we're the figure. We think that we are this figure that is created by denying the whole. So a part can only exist by denying the whole of which it is a part. That's how a part gets to be even seen as anything. A part which did not deny the whole of which it is a part wouldn't be there. So it's like saying a dent in a sheet of metal wouldn't be a dent unless there was a dent. Nothing's really changed, but our attention is drawn to what has been emphasized at the expense of what is not being emphasized. So technically speaking, this is a game, because we don't have to look at things that way, but if we do, we get trapped in that way of looking at things and we don't know the way back. The environmental mode of being in the world is where the figure isn't hugely emphasized at the expense of the ground. And in that case, the ground, rather than being seen as unimportant, something to be exploited, or only there to serve us, is seen as us, just as much as the emphasized element, which is the particular self, the local self, the sense of me being here and not anywhere else, which is obviously something that we always have this sense of locality, usually have this sense of locality, but it can shade into a sense of connectedness as well. So it's mitigated. So this kind of explanation of the two ways of being in the world seems to make pretty good sense. But I can imagine people still having a problem with it and saying, well, it's all just fluffy, really, because at the end of the day, you are this self. You're born this self and you'll die this self. And that this perception we have of being separate from the world is true, because the world goes on when we die, and essentially a lot of people will say that you actually are this self. This is your ultimate reality. Practically everybody would say that, really. yet it's capable to have an experience which completely shows that to be false, and it's an experience any of us could have at any time. We probably don't, and it's the fact that we don't that makes us so confident in our assertions about the reality of the localized or defined self. A good example of something that can happen to make us see things in a different way is given by Jill Bolt in her account of what happens when she has a stroke on the right side of her brain. And so that analytic, rational part of the brain, which works by drawing boundaries around everything and fragmenting everything into categories or different parts, goes offline. And as a neuroscientist, that part of her brain which is analytical is undoubtedly a highly developed one. And we can see from her account that it comes as a tremendous shock to be plunged into this other way of seeing the world, which is the way of seeing the world where we're not seeing everything in terms of boundaries or how this is different from this and separate from this and not the same as this, to seeing the world in terms of its connections. So these are the two complementary ways of seeing things in terms of their differences, which aren't really there. There are no boundaries in reality, really. As Ken Wilbur says, we make up boundaries for convenience. Reality itself, or the universe itself, has no use for them, no need for boundaries. We might be all uptight about boundaries, but that's just us. That's just the game that we're playing. So what happened to Jill is that she became aware of the world as being intricately interconnected in a way that is quite baffling in terms of its complexity and depth. And that's kind of an amazing thing to see. And if you do see it, then that will change your outlook on life. You won't be so dogmatic anymore about the ultimate existence of this thing called a self. It's only our lack of experience of the other side of the coin that causes us to be like that, as I keep on saying. But the point of this discussion is, as long as we are experiencing life on behalf of the partitioned or isolated sense of self, pain will have that particularly persecutory, that particularly unbearable nature. And there's nothing the isolated self can do to change that. But if we were to exercise to some small degree, on maybe only a temporary basis every now and again, which is the freedom not to be this self, and slip into the environmental awareness, the pain is still there, but we're not taking it so personally, and it loses that particular quality which makes it so terrible. So straight away, here is a way of working with pain that just never occurs to us as a culture, really. And in a way, it could be said that when we are in pain, there is a great tendency for us to eventually learn to be this way. Or there's a possibility of us learning. And that is undoubtedly the natural way of things, that the curse of pain brings with it a discovery that can transform the whole way we see life and understand ourselves. Okay, thanks for watching.